welcome back to Lemmy History. I'm here with Nathen Amien to help me with your viewer theories about what happened to the princes in the tower. I picked a couple of them and put them in a presentation, but not every one of you was okay with showing your name, so I will do two out of my mind, out of my memory at the end. And Nathen, hello, and thank you for doing this with me.
Hello, voice over me here. I was a little nervous during the recording. You will probably hear it from time to time, because it was the first time I was having a guest on in a form like this. So I forgot to give you a proper introduction to Nathen during the recording. That's why I'm doing it here. Nathen is a historian and author who wrote 5 historical works in the last decade, which is an incredible achievement. Just believe me, my PhD took me 4 years and that was considered fast. These books are Tudor Wales, York Pubs, Henry VII and the Tudor Pretenders, The House of Beaufort, Son of Prophecy, The Rise of Henry Tudor. I read The House of Beaufort and the book about the Tudor Pretenders. I can recommend both wholeheartedly. The book about the Pretenders was the reason I wanted him on this episode. Nathen is also a co-host of the podcast Aspects of History. Together with Nicola Tellis, he is offering a Wars of the Roses online course dated during what is the date of this recording. I hope they will do it again in the future because I think it's a really great idea. I will leave a link to Nathan's homepage, his Instagram and his Substack in the description. The Substack is free and has excellent articles. I will link my personal favorite article, Bosworth, The Night Before Battle, directly. And now back to the video and the Princess in the Tower.
Yes, thank you very much for having me along. It's always interesting to discuss the Princess in the Tower. People often get quite emotive and it's often quite a heated debate, but there's always something to say when it comes to the Princess in the Tower. Or maybe we should be calling them the missing princes.
The missing princes. I like to call them the king and the prince in the tower, but...
Well, it depends, doesn't it? I mean, technically, some people would consider them to be the king and the prince. Other people might consider them to be just two simple, normal, illegitimate boys. So who knows? There's never any name that fits everyone.
I think we could agree to call them Edward and Richard, but...
Yeah, I mean, that was their name, so I think that's perhaps one thing that everyone can hopefully at least agree on.
Since I've read 2 of your books, namely The House of Beaufort and The Tudor Pretenders, I think we are very much aligned in what happened to them, and that means neither of us is a Ricardian. I think it's fair to say this.
Well, I guess it always depends on what a Ricardian means. I think a lot of people think a Ricardian should mean somebody who champions Richard III's life and is an activist on behalf of Richard III. And in many ways that, in my view, becomes a negative term because people just want to look at the good in Richard, and that's it. Whereas I think a Ricardian should really mean somebody who truly is interested in his life and times and the life and times of all of those people around him. And I think, like anything, you get good Ricardians and perhaps you get less good Ricardians.
Not so good Ricardians, yes. Truth still matters was a saying they liked, and I think I can identify with that. But some of the recent, let's call it research, was not something I can agree with. I'm sorry.
I mean, technically, if the mission statement of the Richard III Society is to study the life and times of Richard, okay, in many ways that would make me a Ricardian because that's precisely what I do. Again, the difficulty is that some people think that there should only be one aspect. And I think we move away from being historians, and then people move into becoming activists with an agenda. And I think that's something completely different to historical study.
I personally think a lot of Ricardians can agree what Richard shouldn't be, the Shakespearean monster, and I can completely agree with that. But they have really trouble to agree on what he has been. And there is where the problem started. He is romanticized, to my impression, in many of their newer works.
Well, yes, this is it. I mean, it's like anything today. They try to be a broad church and they try to encompass all different types of views. But like political parties, there are some views that are just pushed harder and perhaps louder than other voices.
Yeah, and they shouldn't be a political party. Okay, let's start with the first one. I hope you can see it.
Yeah.
Perfect. It's the classical "What if no one killed them and it was natural causes?" What do you think?
Okay, so I think we should just begin first and foremost by letting me lay out my overall disclaimer on the Princes in the Tower. The bottom line is going to be nobody knows what happened. There has to be the single uniting fact that everybody should agree on, but of course, people are not going to agree on that. We simply do not know what happened to these people. Therefore, any potential theory can be put forward and be discussed. But of course, there are going to be some theories that just are more realistic than others. So let's begin with this one from Holly. So the suggestion is perhaps they both died of natural causes, as many young people did back then. I think we've got to be careful in over-exaggerating child mortality, first of all. It is very true to say that when a child was born, there was a high risk of that child dying as an infant. And that is why the overall average life expectancy is quite low for the medieval period. But it's also true to say that once you come through infanthood, the chances are you're going to lead a fairly decent life. You are going to live into your 50s and 60s. You know, there is a great chance to live to what we would now call a middle-aged. So I don't think we should suggest that young people just died quite often back then. It's not the case. We do have some famous examples, of course, like Prince Arthur Tudor or Richard III's own son, Edward Middleham. But we've got to be careful not to make too much of that. So first and foremost, I don't think many young people died that often.
In that age.
Yes, at the age that they were. If one of these princes died, okay, I can see a potential one prince died. But two? That is very careless. For two princes who are being kept in the Tower of London, which is both a prison but also a royal residence, they would have been kept very comfortably as anybody of that age could possibly be kept. If there was an outbreak of disease, where are the records suggesting that other people who would have died of it as well? I think from Richard III's point of view, it might have been very convenient for him to present two dead boys and say natural causes have taken them. You know, I don't work in forensic crimes, but I'm sure that if these boys were strangled, then the medieval average person would not have the kind of medical knowledge to be able to tell a difference between a strangulation, if done well, I suppose, or natural causes. But no one would have believed Richard. No one would possibly have believed if these two boys were presented to him as saying they have just died in their sleep. Nobody would believe that. And I think for that very reason, Richard himself does not present that. So no, it's not impossible. That's the key thing here. None of these theories are going to be impossible. I just don't think it's very likely. It would be very, very careless if these two boys happened to die of natural causes. If they had died of natural causes, it would have solved Richard's problem, even though nobody would have believed him. And he does not say that this happens. So I think that's a major mark against the idea of them dying of natural causes.
I have 2 points I'd like to add to this. Let's say they died of natural causes. They don't just drop dead. They will be sick, and if it's imaginable that they will die, Richard will put them out there, will let people to them and show them, here, they are actually dying. I have nothing to do with that. And second point I would like to add, there were, I think, around 20,000 soldiers in the city. Where are the dead?
Yeah, and I think you've hit a very important point there, that when it comes to Richard III, people often say, his supporters will say that Richard did not kill them. He was not a bad uncle to them. He let them live, and other theories. But, come on, by any stretch of the imagination, the way this man behaved was negligent at best. If we say the princes were allowed to live, do you think that these two boys who were raised to be a king and a prince would have been happy that their birthright had been taken away from them, that their father had just died and they've been removed from their mother and sent to the Tower and then maybe sent abroad? That does not strike me like an uncle who's caring for your best interests. Those boys were raised to be royal. They were not raised to just go and live abroad. If they had died by natural causes, then again, Richard may not have directly have killed them, but he's at fault. Today, if a child dies through negligence by not being looked after, those parents are put in prison. That is, you are indirectly causing those deaths. So if they died of natural causes, that does not make Richard not guilty, not by any stretch of the imagination.
Yeah. I don't disagree. I completely agree. Second one, it's the same idea, but I put it here because the viewer has a question at the end, and I would like you to take a shot at it.
Okay, so the question comes from Anna Lisette, and what does it say? It says, historian Tracy Bowman, who's a very good friend of mine. I do like Tracy a lot. She said in the Tudor period, the monarch most needed to convince and control other nobles. Most regular people seldom, if ever, saw the monarchs and simply lived day to day, working hard to maintain their lives. If Henry VII most needed to court and pacify the nobles, how did this affect the rumours about Edward V and brother Richard? I would suppose the most powerful idea would be that Richard III had murdered him. Okay, this is very interesting. So essentially what we're saying is, how does Henry VII overcome the problem of the princes? People discussing the princes. And something that's very important here we have to consider. Most people would have believed that the princes were dead. And the reason I say that is because in 1483, Henry Tudor is a nobody. Okay? In the first half of 1483, he is just a very random exiled earl living abroad. By the end of the year, the entire Woodville faction and hundreds of Yorkist rebels have left England behind. They have turned their back on Richard III and they've come to Brittany where they've asked Henry Tudor to become their king. There is no way in the world that all of these Woodvilles and all of these Yorkist rebels would ask Henry Tudor to become their king if they believed there was a chance the princes in the Tower were still alive. Let me be clear. It doesn't mean the princes in the Tower had been murdered. It means these people believed they had died, and therefore they were willing to transfer their loyalties to Henry Tudor. So when Henry Tudor does become king, nobody's walking around going, what of the princes? It's already been accepted that they have died and they have perished. And there is no evidence whatsoever, despite what was claimed in a very recent book about the Princes in the Tower, there is no evidence whatsoever that Henry VII ever initiated a search for the bodies, a search for the boys. There is nothing. Because as far as the people were concerned, the matter was finished. The boys had been killed. They had died during the reign of Richard III. So Henry didn't really have to do much. Of course, later on, we do get some pretenders who come back and challenge Henry, particularly the person known as Perkin Warbeck, or as I like to call him, by the name he gave himself, Piers Osbeck of Tournai. Nobody in England of any consequence supports Perkin Warbeck. The highest ranked person who even mentions Perkin Warbeck as a possible son of Edward IV is Sir William Stanley, who is a knight and he has his head cut off for it. Perkin Warbeck never attracts any support whatsoever amongst the English because most people believe there is no case to answer for. It is over. So I don't think Henry VII, quite frankly, had to do much after 1485. What he had to make sure was that as a usurper, living at the end of the Wars of the Roses, it was now obvious to everybody that you could kill a king. You could depose a king. Henry just had to hold on to his throne because he could very easily be turfed out and replaced by anybody. And the person that most English people who did rebel against Henry Tudor wanted on the throne was actually the other prince in the Tower, Edward, the Earl of Warwick, because he now was the heir of York, because everybody believed the princes were dead.
I apologize for looking up to the right. My cat, one of my cats, is is up there, and I am afraid he will jump on me. Yes, thank you. Yes, this is another classical one. The Duke of Buckingham did it. I can't rule it out.
Okay, so the Duke of Buckingham, good old Henry Stafford. This is a theory that has been around for a long time. And quite frankly, cards on the table, I believe that Richard III ordered these boys to be murdered. I cannot prove it because nobody can prove anything when it comes to the Prince of the Tower. But that's what I believe is the most likely outcome. But if I was somehow magically able to solve this case, and it turns out it would be the Duke of Buckingham, I would have no problems with that, because this is a very shady, harsh criminal of a man. The Duke of Buckingham was not a good man whatsoever. We know this because for his entire career, Edward IV had kept him out of power. Even though he was a mighty duke with a royal bloodline, he had no power and no influence under Edward IV. So when Richard III, or Richard Duke of Gloucester, begins to make a rise for the throne, very quickly, this Duke of Buckingham decides to support Richard because this is his path to becoming a rich and powerful man. But very quickly, Buckingham turns traitor. Buckingham helped make Richard III, and in response, he has created the number 2 man in the entire country. He has given all the power, all of the wealth. He is an overmighty magnate. The only person more powerful than him is Richard. But of course, he has ambitions. And these ambitions begin to be stirred by none other than his cousin and his aunt by marriage, Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort uses her agents to reach out to the Duke of Buckingham, how he can believe is reminding him that he has royal blood in his veins. Come the summer of 1483, Buckingham breaks off from Richard III, goes into rebellion, almost certainly to become king himself. And because he's such a detested idiot, he does not get the support he needs. His men do not follow him. He's very quickly betrayed and executed. He is one of the biggest idiots of this period, alongside George, the Duke of Clarence. These are two men who have ambitions but do not have the intelligence or the power or the authority to see their ambitions through. But the key question is, what makes him break with Richard, if not just pure ambition? I can see two things being possibly true. One, he is the person who orders the boys put in the Tower of London. It is on his suggestion the King's Council moved the boys to the Tower of London back in May and June 1483. Does he now find out that those boys have been murdered, and he is so disgusted at this that he defects from Richard? I can believe that. On the flip side, is he the man who has decided to have the princes killed? When he tells Richard, Richard goes crazy. What have you done to me, Buckingham? How dare you do this? People are going to believe it's me. And Buckingham says, oh, well, what's done is done, and then rebels. I can genuinely see both things being true. If you're to ask me what my number one outcome is, I say Richard III killed the Princes of the Tower. Very close after that, I would say Buckingham did it.
Yeah. My number one is Richard. My number two is Buckingham on Richard's orders. My number three is Buckingham on his own volition.
I fully agree. That's an even better way of putting it.
Okay, the next one, I just put it in because it's Philippa Gregory's most infamous theory is touched upon. Margaret Beaufort. I think we can both agree Henry Tudor wasn't it. Henry Tudor was far too busy not to die in Brittany to do it. But Margaret Beaufort, I'm sorry, I know, I hear it a lot of time, I read it a lot of time in comments under my videos, but she just didn't have what she would have needed to do it.
So I can see one line there on the third paragraph that needs to be addressed straight away.
Please.
Margaret had always had a singular goal in her mind, and her piousness would have her believe in every fibre of her being that Henry was sent by God to take the throne. Okay, you have taken that directly from the work of Philippa Gregory, who is a fiction writer who wrote a novel in the last 20 years. That is not history. That is made up by fiction. That has been invented in the mind of a writer living today. We would not accept Shakespeare as being a credible source when discussing Richard III or the Prince in the Tower. So why are we taking this from a fiction writer? It is absurd. It is nonsense. It is insulting, in fact, to consider Margaret Beaufort as a suspect in the Princes in the Tower. I know a Ricardian who is quite elderly now, and she told me at a meeting that before the last 10 years, she had never heard Margaret Beaufort's name mentioned in 50 years of attending Richard III Society meetings. This shows how new the concept of Margaret Beaufort being a suspect is. There is not a single shred of evidence that before Richard III became king, Margaret Beaufort had any ambitions for her son to become king. There is no evidence whatsoever. What Margaret Beaufort wanted for her son was for him to come home to inherit the Beaufort family estates.
And to be safe.
And to be safe. At the end of 1482, she got an agreement from Edward IV to allow her son to come home, to be given a pardon for him to become the Earl of Richmond and the Beaufort heir. And Edward IV agreed. But then he died before he could accept the full pardon. When Richard III becomes king, Margaret Beaufort has a meeting with him and asks him, or I believe asks him the question, can my son go home? And I believe Richard said no, because Margaret begins to plot immediately Richard's downfall. There is no shred of evidence whatsoever that Henry VII, Henry Tudor, was ever mentioned as a king of England before Christmas Day 1483. In the summer of 1483, the first plots are to put the princes in the Tower back where they belong. Then it's Buckingham's rebellion. Only after all of those plots and rebellions fail is Henry Tudor mentioned as King of England, because he's the only person of the right age with a royal lineage who is outside Richard's control. It is absurd to mention Margaret Beaufort as a suspect in this case, and quite frankly, it needs to stop being addressed. It needs to stop being discussed, because it's patently nonsense. Let us just consider one thing as well when it comes to Margaret Beaufort. People often use means, motive, opportunity, the famous, three things that we are told murderers would need to commit a crime. Richard III has means, motive, and opportunity. Arguably, Buckingham has means, motive, and opportunity. Nobody else has those three. Certainly not Margaret Beaufort. Margaret Beaufort, you might think, has the means, but throughout 1483, she's under house arrest. Does she really have a motive? She wants to put, by the end of 1483, it's possible she could put her son on the English throne. We'll maybe give her that. Opportunity? The Tower of London is in control of Richard III's henchman, Robert Brackenbury. Nobody can get into the tower and nobody can get out of the tower except who Robert Brackenbury allows. That is it. It doesn't matter who you are in medieval England. This isn't like you see in the movies. You don't walk in and out of a castle just wearing a hood. Margaret could not get in, and she could not get any of her men in. Do you think Richard III is putting his princes, his nephews, somewhere in the tower that anyone could just get to? People are not using their historical intelligence when they discuss Margaret Beaufort. What is really happening here is this is a horrific case of misogyny that's taking place. We are slandering a woman who was one of medieval England's greatest female figures. She did an incredible progress for the rights of women in our country, for culture, for learning. She should be championed as a woman who really made advancements in what was a man's world. And what is very disappointing to see is most people today who are raising Margaret Beaufort as this witch, they're women themselves. What happened to raising other women? We can do much better than this.
I just want to add one point. For the time in question, Thomas Stanley was in a prison cell. Her husband, that made it even more difficult for Margaret to... She was under house arrest. Thomas Stanley was in a prison cell. There was no chance. I'm so sorry.
We should also say that people do sometimes say that Thomas Stanley was Constable of England during Richard III's reign, which is true. But Constable of England is not Constable of the Tower. People get the two terms completely mixed up.
It was only from December 1483. The boys were long dead by then, after my opinion. But we have 10 minutes left. Then the meeting is done. This is Rich. This is the classical Richard did it at the end. But I have one other, as I mentioned. The boys were brought abroad to Margaret of Burgundy, or into the north to Pontefract or Middleham Castle or something like that.
We would need 10 hours, not 10 minutes, to really go through all of this. But let me try and break it down as quickly as I can. Richard III has taken the crown of England. Now, some will say he took it justly. Some will say he usurped it. It doesn't matter. The bottom line is Richard III has become king. And he's left with the problem of these two nephews. Now, English history shows if you leave a threat to you, a direct threat to your kingship, that is going to come back and cause you a problem. Henry IV, when he usurps the throne, he has to have Richard II killed because people keep on plotting on behalf of Richard II. Similar with Edward II. He has to go. The kings have to go when they are deposed. Edward IV has a similar problem in his brother Clarence. Clarence has a claim to the throne as well, and he's proving a problem. So Edward IV has him killed. Let's fast forward just a little bit. Henry VII is left with the problem of Edward, Earl of Warwick. So he eventually has him killed. That is just a bottom line of what you need to do. So why do people believe that Richard III would somehow allow these two boys to live? Particularly when, in the summer of 1483, there are threats of people launching an attack on the Tower of London to try and get the boys out. If those boys got out, they would be used to front an army which would come and take Richard III down. So do we think that Richard III is the stupidest man ever to have sat on the English throne? The sheer idea that he doesn't just let these boys out of the tower, the idea that he sends them to France and Europe, where his enemies are, waiting to bring him down, must be one of the most stupidest ideas I've ever heard in medieval England. Maybe it happened. Maybe Richard really was that dumb a king, but I do not buy it personally. Let's think about this. Richard III becomes king because of the Wars of the Roses. And what is the Wars of the Roses, if not just one major problem? Because Edward III had 5 sons, and 5 sons all left behind multiple heirs to the throne. Richard III understands what happens when you leave bloodlines living. He inherited the throne through the Mortimer claim. The House of Lancaster should have killed the Mortimer boys back at the start of the 1400s. They did not. They let the Mortimer boys live. Fast forward 50 years, the Mortimer bloodline replaces the Lancastrians on the English throne. Richard III would have known his history, and he would have known what happens if you leave threats live. What people forget is in 1483, Richard III had a son. He had a son, Prince Edward of Middleham. We know this boy would die the following year, but Richard did not know that in 1483. He was looking ahead. If he leaves a rival claim live, in 50 years' time, will the descendants of these princes, his nephews, come back and kill his own grandson? Richard had no option other than to delete those boys, in my opinion. So we don't even need to go into discussing pretenders and princes, because the bottom line is, from the outset, those boys could not be allowed to live. And just to be fair, I will say this. If in September 1485, Henry Tudor comes to London with the crown on his head, he goes to the Tower of London and he opens the cage door, and there are 2 boys, he has those 2 boys killed.
They are dead,
it's
yes.
Exactly the same principle.
But he would have shown them, I think. He would have said, here, I found the bodies of the 2 princes. Here they are. Richard had them killed. But
absolutely. And I think Henry learned from Richard, because he keeps Warwick alive. People think Warwick was killed when he was a child. Warwick was 24 years old when he was finally put to death. But he was never allowed to leave that Tower of London because he had the claim in his blood. He was a problem and he had to go.
Except the one time he was to counter Simnel, but yes.
Yeah, he was brought out of the Tower of London very briefly and introduced to everybody in St. Paul's Cathedral. And for that simple reason, no English nobleman, apart from one, John de la Pole, the Earl of Lincoln, no English noble crossed over to support Lambert Simnel because they'd seen the real Warwick. We can forget the idea that Simnel was Edward V.
That's just
too many holes in that.
That's just incredible nonsense. I'm so sorry, but that's the one that made me really angry. Warbeck, I can see why people like this idea, but Simnel, Edward V? No, come on. Okay, I have a last question. It's not one of my viewers, but just mine, because I'm curious. What do you think, when did they die?
Okay, so my theory is that the Princes in the Tower were killed during the reign of Richard III, and I follow the idea of a Welsh chronicle. And this Welsh chronicle was written 50 years later, so it's not a contemporary source, which means it has its problems. But the contemporary chronicle, written by a Welshman called Ellis Griffith, says that the boys were put into an iron chest. They were taken out on a ship that was heading towards Flanders, and in the Thames estuary, they were simply tipped overboard in an iron chest and drowned. And I think of all of those mafia films that we all like. People putting bodies into the rivers, into the lakes, is something that's always happened. And it answers two questions. Why didn't Richard III show the bodies when it was in his benefit to do so? And when Henry VII becomes king, why didn't he also show the bodies? I think neither man could show the bodies because they were at the bottom of the river. And I think, to me, that simply makes the most sense. You do not bury them at the foot of the stairs, as Thomas More believed. You don't keep the bodies around you. You get rid of them forever. And I think, in my opinion, that makes the most sense.
I'm completely with you on the second part, but I actually believe they died under the reign of Edward V. I think Edward didn't survive his reign, to borrow Michael Hicks' words. I think my point is that John Howard gets Duke of Norfolk on June 28th, and that was not a title Richard inherited from his father, but one he got by marriage, and that meant to me that Howard and Richard III knew, okay, the boy is dead, it's fine.
The Howards have a lot to answer for. The Howards needed those boys dead as well.
Yeah, the Howards would be my number 4. John Howard would be my number 4. Okay, thank you so much, Nathen. The video will be out on February 6th.
Thank you very much.
And I will tag you on social media because of course I will show that you were here and did this with me. Thank you so much, and have a nice evening.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you.